Alrighty, here we go with part número tres of our chapter 15 video lecture. Now we're going to be looking at new monarchies. So I just better say new states. Because during this time period, Europe is going to go through a lot of political changes, and a whole bunch of new countries are going to form that really didn't exist before. And the 30 Years' War and the Reformation, all these events kind of like push countries to become more centralized, more consolidated, more powerful. And at the same time, we see that the old feudal system where the kings share power with the lords and the nobles, right? That system is going to break down as society is going to create a new social class, increasing importance, and that is going to be the middle class, right? Merchants and professionals. So, state building in Europe. How do you build a state? Well, let's get started. So we see that war and trade is going to increase power. So, war. How are you going to get more power through war? Well, through conquest, right? You defeat your enemies, you take their land, you take their stuff, you get more resources, you get more territory. Equally important, if you're in a constant state of war, you're always going to need an army, right? And how are you going to pay for the army? Well, you got to raise taxes, right? The lords, they don't like paying taxes, but the merchants do. The middle class says, sure, we'll pay money to the kings, we'll pay these taxes, and then the king gets to control the military. Now, in the past, the king would have to ask the lords, hey, send me soldiers. And the lords could say yes or no. But now the king doesn't need the help of the lords. He doesn't need the nobility. He has his own army that he funds himself through taxation. Taxation, of course, being a central part of centralization. So there's new armies who are always fighting, and they're all loyal to the king, to the monarch, and they're funded through taxes, paid for by the middle class. Now you got to ask yourself, why would the middle class be willing to pay taxes? That's stealing their money, right? Well, those militaries, whether it's navies or whether it's armies, they also protect trade routes. They also conquer new lands to expand your markets. So war and trade lead to the expansion of centralized power in governments. And we see this start happening in Europe, roughly starting in the 1450s. Now, there's this big war called the Hundred Years' War that lasted, you guessed it, a little bit more than 100 years between France and England. And during this war, this conflict, we see the introduction or the first use of gunpowder technology. And of course, gunpowder came from the Mongols, it came from the Muslims, right? Going way back to the Crusades. But the Europeans, who are always fighting each other, they're going to get that primitive gunpowder technology and they're going to improve on it and improve on it and evolve it and make it better, make it better, make it better, more destructive, more deadly, more mobile. So then they create cannons and muskets, right? The latest and greatest version of gunpowder technology. And one of the things that gunpowder does is that it makes the knights obsolete. Remember, the knights were the power horse, the powerhouse of the medieval battlefield because they had the armor, the weapons, the horse to charge into battle and kill your average foot soldier, right? Who was probably like some poor peasant forced to fight. But now that poor peasant forced to fight has a gun and he can shoot the knight off his horse and kill him with one shot. So knights become obsolete. And who are the knights? Well, they're the nobility. And their only job was to fight. But now the king doesn't need them to fight because of gunpowder. So again, we see the diminishing role of the nobility in these governments of Europe. And so again, the Chinese invented it, the Europeans improve on it. So during this time, 1450 to 1750, we see the increasing development of what we call the nation state, right? Russia, England, France, Portugal, Spain. Those become the first nation states. So what's the difference between a nation and a state? What's the difference between a country, right? So a country, right, is a territory that has defined boundaries, defined borders. That's a country, right? So from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that's the United States, the country, right? Now the state of the United States is the government that runs the country, that operates the country, that supervises the country, that protects the borders of that country, right? Now, the nation is the way people identify to the state. So, if you look at a map of England, or sorry, Spain and France, they're right next to each other. So, you ask, why isn't there one big country called Spain, France? Spain and France combined. Well, it's because they're two different nations, two different cultural identities. The people of Spain are different than the people of France because one is Spanish and one is French. Cultural identity. And England and Portugal, different as well. And Russia, different as well. So nation states, right, which is what we have nowadays everywhere, really, right? That's the modern standard political system in the world today. It starts during this time, right, where the French view themselves as French, right? And it's always easy to view yourself as one thing when you're fighting against something else. So if the English and the French are fighting for 100 years, well, it's easy to say who's English and who's French, right? And if the Europeans are fighting each other, right, we see the buildup of nationality, right? The buildup of nationalism, the belief that your country is awesome. So nation states are being formed, power is increasing to the emperors, to the kings, right? But this is happening mainly in these countries. Italy, Germany, not so much. Remember, Germany is still part of the Holy Roman Empire. Italy is broken up into city states, so they're decentralized. The Holy Roman Empire is decentralized, right? Now, Italy's super rich, but it's decentralized. There's no king of Italy, there's no emperor of Italy. That doesn't exist, at least not yet. Now, another thing that unifies people is religion. And we see this mainly in Spain and Portugal. During the Reconquista, remember that's the reconquest of Spain, where the Christian forces finally pushed out the Muslims, the descendants of the people of Al Andalus, right? They conquer Spain, kick out the Moors, kick out the Muslims, and they have that religious unity, right? They're all Catholics, they're all Christians, and that's going to continue when they expand, and spread their faith to the new world. In Russia, right? This guy, so Vladimir, he's becomes the prince, the grand prince of Moscow. He's going to be the one that kicks out the Mongols. He's going to be the one that creates modern day Russia, right? So new monarchs come to power, right? We don't know their names. You just know there's these new kings, right? These are this Ferdinand Isabel of Spain, King Henry of England over here, King Philip of France over here, and again, feudalism is being replaced. Nationalism comes to power. Nation states come to power. Centralized nation states become the new thing. So to sum it up, new taxes equals more money equals bigger army equals forget the stupid lords equals centralized power, right? So more power to the kings. So let's talk about power to the kings. Well, we have constitutional monarchies. So what's a constitutional monarchy? It's a government that says, here is a list of things you can and cannot do. A document that says that. Well, the first document that said that was the Magna Carta, right, in England, back in the 1200s, back in the Middle Ages, back in the post-classical era. And that document said the king cannot do certain things without the approval of the lords. Now, a more modern version of a constitution is the United States Constitution. Right? We, the people of the United States, blah, 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 blah. But it starts with the Magna Carta, right? And the two main constitutional monarchies is going to be England and Netherlands. And a constitutional government, again, is going to put limits on the power of the monarch. They're going to have representative institute. That means a parliament. That means people who are chosen to represent the people. And equally important, these documents are going to say that every individual has some rights. Citizens have rights. People have rights. Humans have rights. Now, what do these places have in common? Well, they're both trading empires. England and Netherlands are going to grow super wealthy by the 14, 15, 1600s, right? They're going to trade more than anyone. They're going to have a large, strong middle class that pays taxes to fund wars and armies, right? Now, Britain has been kind of like the longest one when it comes to constitutional limits, right? Magna Carta was first. Then we had in the 1600s something called the English Civil War, where the parliament and the king go to war against each other, and the end result is the king loses more power and the people gain more power. So that's always nice. Then we have the Glorious Revolution, which is that the parliament brings in these two monarchs uh, from the Netherlands to come in and rule over England. They invite them, and in exchange, these new kings they write these laws called the English Bill of Rights that guarantees and protects the rights of the English citizen. So Britain has a long history of limiting the power of the king. All right, so there's more of a balance between the parliament, the king, and your average people. Right, so this is the Big Ben, right, the famous Parliament House. This is where Parliament meets, which is kind of the same thing as the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., where the House and the Senate meet. All right, next we have absolute monarchies. So, absolute monarchies. Let's start with the first one over here. This is the Holy Roman Empire. Where do we start with these people? All right, so the Holy Roman Empire goes way back to the Middle Ages, and the Holy Roman Empire combines parts of Germany, Italy, and a whole bunch of other places, right? And the Holy Roman Empire tends to centralize, right? And the main guy is Charles V, and he attempts to centralize, but he fails. Right? There's simply too many people working against them. You have people on the inside. Even the German princes don't want him to have too much power because then they'll take away their power. France doesn't want him to have power because then it will become a threat to France. And the Turks also get involved because they don't want the Holy Roman Empire to gain any more power. So Charles V failed for a whole bunch of reasons. And the point is, the Holy Roman Empire is going to remain decentralized. There were attempts to centralize it, but those attempts never really passed. Then we have, the other absolute powers, and the main ones are going to be France and Spain, and Russia, sort of, kind of. Now, these three countries, these three centralized absolute monarchies, are going to claim divine right to rule. The monarch is going to claim that they have been chosen by God, that they are the lieutenant of God. Again, none of this is new ideas in world history. And therefore, they can do whatever they want. Because if God gave them permission, then clearly God gives them the right to do whatever they want. So, absolute monarchies, the monarch will rule with absolute power. And there is no questioning that. There is no reforms, there is no revolution, there is no Bill of Rights, there is nothing. You simply accept it. It's God's will, right? So you have the God, you have the monarch, you have the nobles, and of course the people at the bottom, the commoners, right? Notice that there's no middle class here. Now, the most famous absolute monarch was this guy. His name was Louis the 14th, and he's famous for quoting "Le Estat c'est moi." Translation: I am the state. I am France. I am everything. Without the king, there is nothing. Right? And this guy, he builds Versailles, right? This famous palace in probably the greatest palace in the world, super wealthy, super rich, lots of money and resources went to it. And what he would do is that he would invite all the nobles to come over and he'll throw them parties, right? And basically, while the nobles were there partying it up and drinking it up, right, the king would say, "Okay, sign away your power. Like now that you're drunk, go ahead and sign this document and give me more power and give me more power and give me more power." And the nobles gave away all their power basically, and the king controlled everything, and no one had the power or authority to rise up against him. So France is going to be an absolute monarchy. Around the same time, we're going to see um, that Russia is going to modernize. Russia is going to undergo centralization as well. Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, right? We're going to talk about them more in another chapter, right? They're going to centralize power as well, right? There's a story of Peter the Great going around cutting men's beards because he says that wearing beards is too much of an Asian tradition, that it's not, Western enough. So he's fascinated with copying everything that France and England and Germany does. So by the time period ends, right? Remember, Unit 4, I should say, ends around 1750. These are all the different states of Europe, right? So France, Spain, Portugal, Britain, right? Holy Roman Empire is still a big mess. Russia's growing in power, right? And then the Ottoman empires are still kind of there. We'll talk about them in another chapter as well. Now, one of the things that develops during this time between all the European countries is a policy called the balance of power, where different countries will unite together to put limits on the power of another state that's growing in wealth and power. So, for example, when Spain was growing in wealth and power from its conquest of the New World, England and Holland or Netherlands will get together and say, okay, let's go to war against Spain. Let's try to limit their power so they don't get too strong. And when France rises to power in the 1700s, England, Holland, Spain, Russia, they'll get together and say, okay, let's ally, let's make an alliance and put an end to France so that France doesn't get too powerful. So the problem with this system, right, is because they don't want one country to gain all the power and control all of Europe, is that you're always in a constant state of war, right? Because there's always someone rising and there's always people who are willing to fight against them and unite against them to weaken them. So there's always a constant state of war, and it kind of goes up and down. Some years you're weak, some years you're strong, right? And it goes back and forth. And this is going to be the kind of the standard international uh, policy or relations between the European countries all the way into the 20th century, all the way into World War One. So they're always going to unite against each other whenever it's convenient, and these alliances are always going to shift back and forth, and war is always going to be a key or going to be a big part of European history. All right, so that's it for part numero tres. Oh wait, no, there's more. How can I forget? Hold on, hold on. Wow, I totally forgot about this. All right, scientific revolution. Boom, look at this solar system, right? So, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, the Catholic Church preached that this was the model of the solar system, right? This is known as the geocentric or earth centered, that everything, the moon, planets, the sun, everything revolves around the earth. Now, going back to the ancient Greeks and even the people of the Muslims or the Arab Empire, there are some people who question this already. But because the Bible said that the earth was created and everything, it was, earth was the center of everything, the Catholic Church always said the earth was the center of everything. And then in the 1600s, after increasing importance of education, more and more people are getting educated. More and more books are available because they become cheaper because of the printing press. more and more people start questioning the old ways of thinking, whether the old ways are the Greek ways or the Roman ways or the Christian Catholic ways. And they start looking at science and reason, right? And these people are getting educated because of the Renaissance brought education back to Europe, and the Reformation everyone wants to get educated so that they can read the Bible. Well, they're not just going to read the Bible; they're going to read books of science and teachings and writings of people who are examining and making experiments and viewing things differently. And one of the first guys that does this is Copernicus. And Copernicus writes, after observing the movement of the planets and the stars and the moon, that Earth isn't the center of our solar system, the sun is, and he calls it the heliocentric model. But Copernicus, he's living right in the middle of the Protestant Reformation, so he just stays quiet. He's hush hush about it because he knows that if he publishes his findings, it'll surely bring problems, right? Because he's going to question Catholic teachings. Later on, another guy called Galileo comes in and he creates a telescope, and he also makes the same observations of Copernicus, and he also knows that Copernicus is right, and he publishes his writings, and the church banishes him, the church threatens him, the church puts him under house arrest and tells him you can never publish these things, you have to take them back, right? And then later on in the 1700s, we have an English astronomer, an English mathematician, one of the biggest geniuses in world history, this guy Isaac Newton. And he also comes up with the same theory. So people are using their observation, they're collecting um, uh, facts, they're collecting statistics, they're collecting data, right? And they're using their brain, their reason, their knowledge, plus all these facts and statistics and observations, right, to come up with how the world works, how the universe works. And that's what we call a scientific revolution. So it's not just accepting that the universe was created by God in 7 days, which is the standard tradition for the last, you know, 2,000 years or so. But now the Europeans are looking at the world and saying it's different, right? And we can understand it and we can look at it. And this, of course, is going to bring a lot of problems with the church, right? And this is Galileo being about to be accused for his scientific discoveries, right? So here we see all the different scientists, right? There's a whole bunch of them. You don't need to know all of them. But all of these individuals contributed to the scientific revolution. They contributed to the understanding of our world and our universe through observation, science, and reason, and not relying on religious beliefs. And of course, the scientific method, which you're all familiar with, right? That begins during this time. Modern sciences begin during this time as well. Now, women were excluded. There were a few exceptions, but women, as you can imagine, were excluded from the scientific revolution because they weren't educated and they wouldn't have been able to get any type of career or job using their brain. All right, last thing we're going to talk about is the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is kind of the continuation, in a way, of the scientific revolution. We're going to talk about more about the Enlightenment in the future, another chapter. But sometimes we also call it the Age of Reason. It starts around the 1700s. So what's happening is that those same ideas that Europeans have about um, trying to understand the world through science, right? New philosophers, new thinkers are saying, okay, if we can understand the world through science and God's work through science, then we can also understand human nature. We could also understand governments. We could also understand economics. We can understand how humans, governments, and money, economics, how they all interact with each other. And if we understand the interaction, the way it works, then we can create a new system that benefits everyone. we can make the world a better place to live in. And that's the goal of the Enlightenment: make a world a better place to live in for everyone, or as many people as possible. So we have all these famous philosophers. Again, you don't need to know them right now. We're going to talk about them in a future chapter. All right, John Locke, Adam Smith, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Voltaire. These are the Enlightenment thinkers. They come up with a lot of ideas that we now consider, or as part of our modern world, right? Things like religious tolerance, separation of power, freedom of speech, the social contract between the individual and the government, right? Here's some of their famous quotes. Right. So the idea is that the Enlightenment people, they're going to take, the spirit of the scientific revolution of trying to understand everything to the next level of trying to understand everything in, our society, in our government, and in our state, and try to fix it, try to make it better. All right. And here we see again more famous quotations from these Enlightenment thinkers. Again, don't worry about what they're talking about. Don't worry about what they say, because we're going to focus more about them later on um, in a future chapter. So again, here we sum it up. The goal of the Enlightenment is to create a better world with reason, right? Not superstition, not spirituality, not religious belief, but reason. All right, so that's the official ending for this section, part 3. We're going to go next to economics in our part 4. See you then.